A man once crawled 200 miles with a broken leg, infected injuries, and no supplies through a wilderness that essentially killed most. Not because he was superhuman, not because he had military training, but because of something much darker. A psychological adaptation that most people will never survive. This is Hugh Glass, so what happened to him reveals the terrifying reality about what the human mind will do to keep you alive. The movie is Irreverent, a movie that shows this horrible journey played by Leonardo DiCaprio, who eventually goes to win an Oscar for his portrayal. So the real Hugh Glass didn't just crawl 200 miles after the bear attack, he did something far more interesting. He rewired his brain to survive in a way that changed him forever. It showed the visceral, tactical horror of a grizzly bear attack. This film captures an attack so realistically, you want to help Leonardo's character in the situation. Imagine Hugh Glass in those moments, his fear, his physical pain, only to then crawl 200 miles, driven by one thing. But why? But here's what the movie could not show you. The real horror story was not the bear attack. It was not even watching his companions abandon him to die. It was what happened to Hugh Glass during those 200 miles of crawling through hell. So this is why Hollywood could not tell the full story. The Reverend gave us a realistic violence and a brutal revenge story because that's what modern audience expect from a survival thriller. But the real Hugh Glass story is far more incredible. In the film, Glass fights Fitzgerald on a frozen riverbank. It's beautiful, it's shot incredibly, but the reality was that's not what happened when the real Hugh Glass finally tracked down John Fitzgerald in June 1824. He discovered something that shattered everyone. Fitzgerald had enlisted in the US Army, so he could not hurt him. The Great Revenge Saga ended not with a bang, but with justice. Glass spoke to Fitzgerald, reclaimed his rifle, and walked away. The most brutal survival story in American history ended in just that moment.
The theme of the film is survival through physical pain.
Of course he's talking about the movie, but here's what the movie missed. The real story is not what revenge does to you. It's about what happens when you crawl so far, you emerge incapable of revenge at all. The film creates a villain in Fitzgerald, a monster who deserves everything he gets. But the real Fitzgerald was just a scared man who made a terrible decision under pressure. And that's the psychological horror Hollywood could not touch. Glass didn't forgive a monster, he forgave ordinary men. This is where the real psychological experiment begins. When Glass regained consciousness and found himself alone, stripped of his weapons with a broken leg and injury so deep, something happened in his brain. Then Glass, a trauma researcher, asked this question that cuts to the heart of Glass transformation. Should traumatic experiences equal suffering and pain?
And I know it may seem trivial, maybe even simple to try and glean positives from such huge-scale social trauma.
But Hugh Glass' brain didn't just follow those rules. Instead, it did something that modern psychology continues to understand. And what happened inside Hugh Glass was a complete rewiring of his survival system. Mile by mile, his mind was adapting to a reality that should have been impossible to survive. So similar to the movie, the men who abandoned him were John Fitzgerald, an experienced woodsman driven by fear of Indian attacks, and Jim Bridger, just 19 years old in his first wilderness expedition. In the movie, Fitzgerald becomes a cold-blooded villain who eventually kills Glass' fictional son. But the real story is far more complex. These men were not monsters. They were terrified men making a brutal calculation for survival. Glass was conscious during the abandonment, unable to speak or move, and forced to watch them leave. Imagine lying there, helpless, as the people you trusted walk away. That's not just physical trauma, that's a complete shattering of your trust. Somewhere during those 200 miles, the rage that had kept him alive began to transform into something else entirely. When Glass finally met them at the fort, the witnesses expected violence. Instead, seeing the boy's terror and shame, Glass did something that defied every expectation. He forgave them, but what he discovered was that the journey itself had changed him so completely that he was no longer capable of the violence that had kept him alive. That requires a level of psychological evolution that doesn't fit into a 2-hour revenge thriller. Mile by mile, Glass' brain had been conducting his own experiment in human psychology. The rage that kept him alive was literally eating him from the inside, so his mind made a choice: survival or vengeance. This is why we tell revenge stories instead of forgiveness stories. Revenge gives us something to follow, closure, the satisfaction of justice served. Forgiveness gives us something much more uncomfortable, realization that survival sometimes means becoming someone you never thought you could be. The real Hugh Glass didn't just survive the wilderness, he survived his own rage, his own internal prison. But here's the part that will blow your mind about how reality and fiction blend together. The Reverend was not just inspired by Hugh Glass, it was filmed in locations that mirror the psychological themes in ways that filmmakers never intended. What nobody realized was that the making of the film would force its creators to live their own version of Glass' psychological ordeal. While the real Hugh Glass crawled across the plains of South Dakota in late summer, places so isolated that cast and crew had to be helicoptered daily. Leonardo DiCaprio described it as the following.
It was the hardest, professional thing that I've ever done, for sure.
The entire production became its own survival story. Crew members quit, equipment froze, and they were filming in a weather that dropped to -40 degrees. But here's the psychological twist. Cast and crew were experiencing their own version of what Hugh Glass went through. Not the physical trauma, but the mental adaptation. Leonardo ate raw bison liver. He was sleeping in animal carcasses and endured months of brutal conditions. The method acting became method surviving. But the real meta twist goes deeper. The locations they chose, vast, empty wilderness where humans are just specks against nature. These places do something to your psychology. They shrink your sense of self until survival becomes the only thought that matters. And here's the final twist. While Hollywood was trying to capture Glass' physical journey, they accidentally recreated his psychological one. The cast and crew who survived that production understand something most audience never will. The real story is not about what Glass endured, it's about what he became. So this is why we're obsessed with Hugh Glass' story. Not because he survived a bear attack, not because he crawled 200 miles with broken bones and infected wounds, but because his story reveals the most terrifying reality about human consciousness. We're not who we think we are. So we keep telling these stories because they tap into our deepest fear, that the person we have built our entire identity around. That survival means becoming someone we don't recognize. Most of us will never crawl 200 miles, but all of us will face moments that test the boundaries of who we think we are. Job loss, betrayal, illness. The final revelation from Hugh Glass' story is that survival is the enemy of identity, that forgiveness is sometimes just another adaptation, and that the person you think you are is just one extreme situation away from disappearing forever. If you ever wondered how much trauma it will take to completely change who you are, because the human mind capacity for self-destruction and self-recreation is far more terrifying than any bear attack. The question is not whether you could survive what Hugh Glass experienced. The question is, will you still be you when it's over?